and we will be recording. Um, so if anyone has any privacy concerns, feel free to turn off your video. Otherwise, we really would appreciate you had your video on for the session so that we can all feel like we are in the room together. It also helps us really be more present, and something that we would encourage you to also tell your students, right? So to help with student engagement is to turn on that video if they can. Okay, next slide. So here's our roadmap for today. We're really going to focus on equitable student engagement. So really think about approaches to create an inclusive and equitable climate in the classroom in the remote environment, right? So we're going to first think about what are critical equity considerations in remote teaching. We'll talk about how we can adapt generally inclusive teaching practices to engagement during remote teaching, so applying those practices in the remote environment. We'll consider how to integrate 4 overarching principles that are really created to think about equity in the remote teaching. And so we'll go over those 4 principles, and then think about how you can shift things to asynchronous instruction, which is something some of you may have thought about more or less. But we're gonna think about both asynchronous and synchronous, and how you might be able to shift some of that synchronous activities to the asynchronous world. Okay, next slide. All right, so as I said, I'm Rachel Kennison, and we have our team with us that have really been had incredible contributions to all of our workshops. I do want to first start by acknowledging that UCLA is a land-granted institution, and even though we're not there physically, we are there virtually. So we want to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielano and Tongva peoples. So our team consists of Shauna, who you've just met. She is our Senior Associative Director. Her background is physics. My background is life sciences. We have Katie Dixie, who is also one of our assistant directors, and she also is a life scientist. We have 3 amazing grad students that are working with us this summer. We have Kiana Fox, if you want to raise your hand. She is a PhD student in higher ed and organizational change. We have Ben Ha, and he is from ecology and evolutionary biology, and Samantha Mensa, and she is a material chemist. And then we have our beloved Jenny Casey here, who's an instructor in chemistry. And so you can see we're really coming at this from a variety of different backgrounds and perspectives, and we've really valued everyone's different points of view as we've been developing these materials. Next slide. Okay, so I just want to kind of acknowledge this New Yorker cartoon, and the fact that kind of where we were in spring as really this crisis mode and emergency mode of teaching, shifting to the remote environment. And at that point, it was really a crisis situation. We were all doing our best, faculty and students, to adjust to that, did the best we could. And although now we may be better adjusted, I think everyone maybe is a little bit more familiar at this point of being on Zoom. Trying to function normally is still a problem, right? Still a challenge, right? And so we really want to be cognizant of what we're asking students to do and address and adjust our expectations accordingly, right? Because not only, like us, not only are we asking them to learn all these new concepts and engage, but we're also have to recognize all the different challenges that they have by still being at home and not in an academic environment, and all the different issues that brings up for them, and stresses and pressures. So, yep, thank you. So we want to also just sort of set the context here of what we mean by teaching equitably, right? And you know, we kind of throw these terms around: equitable and equal, and inclusive. So we just want to make it clear what we mean by these definitions. Whereas equality is often referred to as kind of thinking about treating everybody the same. When we do that, we are not recognizing that people are coming from different backgrounds with different levels of performance, with different ideas about learning, and different cultures and different ways of learning, different ways of thinking, right? So if you kind of look at the bicycles, it's the idea here is that if you give everybody the same bicycle, but people have different points of view, perspectives, abilities, strengths and weaknesses, not all of them are going to be able to succeed, right, in the same way and at the same rate. But if you create a bicycle that fits the needs of that person, then each person will have an opportunity, have an equal opportunity to be able to achieve in a much more equitable way. So that's kind of the differentiation between equality and equity. When we think about inclusion, we think about creating a culture, right, for all of our students to be able to learn and to be able to achieve, and where all voices and participation is valued. Okay, so why should we focus on equity in this workshop or around these ideas? And what we want to think about here is the broader context, right, of our institutional history, right? Higher education institutions were founded and designed to serve white students, particularly those who are male, mid to upper class, heterosexual, able-bodied, and Christian, right? So if we think about that historical context and think about where we are now, right? And Shauna, next paragraph, thanks. We know that our students come from a diversity of backgrounds, right? But our institution hasn't really been reconfigured to equitably support, affirm, and validate all those students from all the different underrepresented, and particularly those from underrepresented groups in STEM, right? So we want to think about how that those structural policies and the way our institution is designed and the way we design our teaching to really adapt and really change to make that environment more equitable for all of our students. And there's one more animation there, Sean, I think. Yeah. So as instructors, we have this opportunity to really affirm the belonging of underrepresented students in higher education. One example of that is by representing their experiences in courses, in our course materials, but we're going to talk about lots of different ways that you can do that as an instructor. Okay, I'm going to hand this over to Katie.
So as we kind of move into this, just to set the stage a little, there's some lessons that we learned from spring quarter. So we had this quick shift to remote teaching. And so actually, Shauna, can you go to the next slide real quick? So there was a UC Undergraduate Experiences Survey, or called UQs, which all UCs were asked to get some data from the undergraduate students. And so we had about 3,000 reply. And what they found is like 40% of students had additional family care responsibilities, which may be true for you also. But if you think of, daycare maybe being shut down, or, there are students who are non-traditional students with children. So a couple of quotes from students here is that, for example, one of them had their parents was completely unemployed or lost their job, and they felt obligated to be more present with the parent and therefore took on more responsibility in their house. Another quote here is from a student who had several siblings, and this is about their Wi-Fi and access, where it would crash a lot because they were all trying to be on the internet at the same time and actually sharing electronics. So they didn't even have their own computer to use for class. So if you could go to the one before this now, Shauna. So this is some data that came out of a study that was just published from a large chemistry class actually at UCLA. So it was done by Rashini Ramachandran and Marlius Rodriguez here at UCLA. And what they found is that a lot of students in their class didn't even have a quiet place for their exams or for class in general. They didn't have access to a scanner or a printer, and so they weren't able to print out worksheets, for example. And they had a lot of other commitments. So this is just kind of a further breakdown of the commitments they had. So now if you go to the next two. So what they also found is that there were some students who were actually concerned about their basic needs being met. So about 18% of students, the majority of which were Pell Grant recipients, first generation, or transfer students. And this is a quote from one where they had to move because they could no longer afford to pay their house, pay for their house, and they had to pick up extra hours at work. And so this is something that is really adding to the load and the cognitive load and the concerns that students are experiencing right now that makes it really difficult for them to focus on their schoolwork. Let me have one last piece of data I want to share with you is that 54% of students were feeling very concerned about being socially isolated, right? There's a lot of mental health issues that are really bubbling to the forefront right now. And so students are really getting a lot of anxiety from being in a pandemic, from the racial unrest that's in our country right now. And so it's really weighing them down, and they don't necessarily have the access to the same resources, or they don't think they do. There may be resources out there that you might want to, as an instructor, be aware of and share with them. So it's hard for them to handle their anxiety. But out of this survey, some positive things did come out, and students did note and were extremely grateful when faculty were flexible and responsive to their needs. So this is something to kind of think of as we move forward into our discussion today, and just as thinking into the fall semester or quarter. So we're going to go into kind of our next part here, and we're going to think about how we can adapt some inclusive teaching practices to a remote environment. So these are inclusive practices to get students engaged in class. And so how we can frame that in this particular environment. So we're going to do a little breakout room where we have a smaller group discussion. And right now I'm going to share a link to Instructional Inclusive Teaching Checklist. And on that list, you'll see a couple different potential strategies that you could use in your class to make it more inclusive and get student engagement. There are some strategies maybe that relate easily to remote teaching, but we'd like you to go through and think about how you could adapt some of these to your remote teaching environment. So I'll share the link right now. So we're going to give you 5 minutes to look over that. There's a lot of text in there, but we want to just have you look through. And then we will be going into our breakout rooms to discuss with our groups how you can adapt it for a remote environment. So with that, we'll take our 5 minutes now, and then we'll go into the breakout rooms after that.
Any questions on what to do? And you can ask them, just speak and ask them, or ask them in the chat. One person asked what wait time is, which is referenced in the doc, and that's the process that doesn't apply to remote teaching as much. It's giving time after you ask a question for students to think about it and respond. But you can think about in remote teaching, what are versions of wait time where you let students think about what you ask and get a chance to respond. Thank you, Karina, for that question. And Andrew asked what name tent is. Again, that's a real world thing that's good to know, where you fold up your piece of paper and write your name on it. In Zoom, thankfully, we don't need that as much because your name is right there. But there's other options like Padlet that you could do.
All right, so if you want to finish the thought you're on right now, I'm going to pull us back so that we can go to our breakout rooms. But before we do, I have another document to share with you. And so if you go back to the slides real quick, Shauna. In the breakout rooms, again, we're going to discuss how you might adapt these and talk about the ones that really jumped out to you. But in that, we have a space for each group to take notes. And just to make it easier than having to wait for someone to volunteer, we'd like the person whose first name is first alphabetically in your group to be the note taker and write notes on. And so we'll rotate those through different ones. Okay, and we will have facilitators in each room that will be there to help with this, but really we'd like you all to kind of lead the discussion. So I just put the document in there, and it should be on the very first page with the instructions. Any questions? All right, great. Well, we will see you in a little bit.
Welcome back, everyone. I know there were a lot of great ideas in everyone's groups. Let's see. Oops. Thank you. All right, so hopefully that kind of gave you a taste and started you thinking about some of the challenges. I know our group talked about some challenges in terms of being able to do some of these activities in the remote environment, and hopefully you were able to brainstorm some ideas. And we're going to talk about these things in more detail as we continue on here. The next piece of this is thinking about how to integrate these 4 overarching principles, which include remote teaching, which include reflection, flexibility, transparency, and how to build community in the remote environment. So next slide, please. So these principles came from Karen Gosling from Yale, a webinar that I went to where she presented this, and we just thought it was a really nice framing for how to think about how to do some of these things equitably online. Next slide. Okay, so the first thing is this idea of reflecting. And so particularly when we're teaching remotely, and now we've kind of had some of us have had some experience in spring, maybe in summer, and now it's time to kind of reflect on that experience and think about how we can really be intentional in how we design our course for the fall. One way to think about it is to get feedback from students, right? So surveying your students before class about some of the challenges that they had can help you address them proactively as you are moving into designing your fall quarter. Another important piece in reflecting is not just at the beginning, but checking in with them on a fairly frequent basis, right? So thinking about asking them what's working for you, what isn't working for you in this environment, how can things improve? The other piece of it is actually teaching students to learn how to reflect on their own learning, right? To self-assess, to be a self-regulated learner. And although we're not going to go into detail about how you might teach them that, we do have a ton of resources on this. And it's especially in the remote environment where we can't assume that students know how to self-regulate. In the normal environment, we can't, but especially in the remote environment where time management is such a major issue and learning how to really balance your time and figure out how much time things are going to take in all these different courses, and you're in cyberspace. And so really helping them right from the outset understand the best ways to do that. There's a great interview with Dr. Courtney Platts. This is a podcast where she talks about how to use self-directed learner, how to teach self-directed learning in the online environment for students, and how that really helps them achieve at a much higher level, especially those who are underrepresented. Next slide. So the second principle really has to do with flexibility, and I'm sure you've all heard a lot about be flexible, be flexible. And really it is something that the students really appreciated and noticed in the spring. We heard that in the data. So thinking about how you can have contingency plans when things that you're planning that have to do with hardware, with internet, with the timing of exams, for example, just being able to find a contingency plan to make sure that you know that you let them know and are very explicit about what is going to happen if things go wrong, right? This is I've already thought about this ahead of time. If your internet goes down in the middle of exam, this is what's going to happen. This is what you're going to do. So this gives them a sense of relief and shows them that you care and that you understand there's lots of uncertainties, but you're on it. You're ahead of it. You've thought about it, and this is how you're going to be flexible and work with them. The other thing is to really find multiple ways for them to participate. We're going to talk about this in a lot more detail a little bit later. Next slide. The third principle is about being transparent, right? About the way that you're communicating, about the reasons why you're doing what you're doing in terms of how you've designed an activity, why you've designed it that way, and also where they stand in the class. So again, imagine, they're out there in cyberspace, they're trying to keep track of all their assignments, they don't know, what grades they got on, where in the past when we were in person, maybe we weren't paying as much attention to this, but in the remote environment, it's really important for them to have a sense of security and understanding where they're standing in the class and how they're getting that feedback, right? So they have a sense of what they need to be doing, what they need to be working on, where they might be falling behind. So we recommend weekly or even more frequent check-ins with them that update them on their assignments and their grades, etc. It may feel like a lot of hand-holding, but it's really much more important in the remote environment that they feel that connection with you or with your TAs, right? That someone is watching, someone's listening, someone is there. If you find that there are students who are not participating, it's really important to reach out to them sooner rather than later, right? As soon as you see that there might be a pattern of a lack of participation, make sure not to assume why, right? We want to be clear that, you know, we want to give them the benefit of the doubt and realize that because there are so many different factors and pressures that they're dealing and trying to manage, just by asking the question, you know, why, you know, I noticed you haven't been participating. Is something going on? Do you want to let me know? You're really going to get a much clearer sense of what's happening with that student. Next slide. And then lastly, building community. I know this came up in our group as a real concern of how to do this in the remote environment, and it's challenging. Like, there's no way around that, right? It is a challenging thing. We're all feeling socially isolated. We're going to talk a lot about asynchronous and synchronous sessions and how to create community in both those types of environments. We know that while students appreciate the flexibility of being able to do things on their own time asynchronously, they do miss those in-person connections. So giving them some opportunity to be together online, and we'll talk about a variety of ways to do that, is really important. And we'll talk about also how do you might find ways to assign groups or pairs that can meet up on their own time so that they do have an opportunity to form that community outside of class. It's really important that you're explicit, if you're doing that, as to why you're doing it, right? That you want them to build community and that you're going to help them do that and help them structure it, because on their own they may not. But if they know that this is a priority for you because you want them to build that community, that might incentivize them to do it more. And then again, providing resources or platforms where they can connect. That's okay, I'm good. You can move on. All right. So we're going to go into our second breakout room now, and we really want you to think about these 4 principles. And so we will once again ask someone with the first name alphabetically, or you can pick the next person alphabetically, to record the responses, and then the last person to share out. We will have a share out after this. So what we want you to do is share with your group how you might incorporate one of these strategies from one strategy from each of the principles. If you're already using some of these strategies, share how it's going, if there are challenges involved in that, and have the note taker jot down notes for each one of the principles, and you'll do that on the Google Doc, okay? And your group number is the breakout number of your breakout room. Does anybody have any questions about what we're doing? Okay. I think we're going to head into our breakout rooms.
Okay, I think this is me. So welcome back, everybody. And I hope you all had some helpful discussions. And what came up in my group is to realize there's no perfect solutions to any of these questions. And so what we like about these principles is they at least guide us in thinking about the most appropriate fit for this situation. But none of it's stuff we're going to be happy with always because we're not used to it. So the last bit that we're going to talk about is considering how we can shift things to asynchronous instruction and make the most of the time that we have for synchronous instruction. So I want to just define some terms so that I'm not like the instructor that assumes you know everything, that just because I know it now. So synchronous instruction is where we're talking about the live Zoom sessions, any sort of live quizzes, live polling, live interactions. And asynchronous is things like discussion boards, quizzes, polls they can do anytime, email, all the things that happen on their own time a little bit. So for many of us, the easiest thing, and when we have the least time, we often need to do the easiest thing, is just give our normal lecture or discussions synchronously people who can come, we record it and we share it with anybody who couldn't make it. And I think a lot of people lean towards that. And some students also ask for that, right? They like that. They like to come synchronously, and they feel like they learn better that way. But I do want to remind us that there's a lot of cognitive psychology studies on how students feel like they learn better versus how they actually learn better. And to think about the students who aren't able to join synchronously, instead of watching like a nice asynchronous learning experience, they're watching a lecturer talk and then some people asking chats, and so not getting as good of an asynchronous session. That's what we want to think about. So I'm going to hand it over to Katie.
It's kind of going back to our student quotes and our student data about this. I have a couple here that we picked out about how some students who are maybe international students are in a totally different time zone, and so doing lectures or taking midterms at 4 a.m. in the morning, you can imagine that's not how you're going to be the most focused at that time. That's pretty disruptive. Or for some students, their internet just cuts out, and so maybe their internet's not working right before class starts and they have to miss it, right? So that can be really stressful for when it comes to participating. So these are some things that we need to kind of think about and why having this asynchronous piece will be useful. But then again, and this is another quote from a student about synchronous sessions, is that they found it was great to be in those live kind of lectures because it stimulated the environment of a classroom, that community, and helped work through problems. So we have kind of some conflicting things here, right? So the question now is, how do we create asynchronous environments or asynchronous activities that kind of mimic and model and bring in the benefits of having this face-to-face? How do we find the balance between the two? Maybe we have some synchronous and some asynchronous pieces. Right, so these are some things to kind of think about as we move on. So when we're thinking about reflecting and the flexible piece, being very flexible about hardware, internet timing, this is where the asynchronous pieces come in. But maybe community building, maybe you have some synchronous aspects to this. And so these are some potentials to think about as we move forward when we think back to those different topics we just discussed.
Okay, thanks, Katie. We're going to start thinking about ways to do various components asynchronously. And this isn't saying that you all need to make everything asynchronous, but then that can help you decide which asynchronous components to implement in your own course most easily. So what I'm going to do right now is talk about moving to asynchronous. We have a big enough group here that we're going to do this as a group instead of on the Google Doc, because that can get crazy from experience. But I have this table of synchronous things you would do in class. And I want to encourage us as a group to think about how we would move those to asynchronously. And so you can unmute yourself, type in the chat. I have them all being seen. But thinking about these synchronous things, giving a lecture to present information, working through a problem on the chalkboard, providing a worksheet, having students collaborate on a drawing or concept map, or discuss questions to solve a problem, and then polling students in class quizzes or writing activities, or having students present. So does anybody want to share things they've done in the spring that worked asynchronously with the group? And Michelle Rensel pointed out how awkward wait time feels in class time, let alone on Zoom. So I'm just modeling to you all. It does feel awkward, but I'm going to give it some time for people to share. So Michelle, did you want to share something? Experience you had?
Yeah, so I was going to say, in spring, my students had to give like final project presentations for my small seminar, and normally those would have been live. So I had the students actually just record their presentations and post them on CCLE, and then ask the students to view and comment on a certain number of their peers' presentations, which worked really well, except for the couple of students who had issues uploading even a 5-minute video to CCLE, which we figured out. But yeah, that seemed to work pretty well.
Perfect. Thanks, Michelle, for sharing. And that's good to know that that works well. That's definitely also what we recommend at CEILS. I talked to one student who had to do a synchronous presentation, and she was so nervous, like doing a presentation, let alone worrying about your internet. It's very stress-inducing. Would anyone else like to share how they moved any of these to asynchronous, or how they could imagine doing so?
You can share in the chat also.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have to confess, I didn't really do a whole lot of asynchronous in the spring. Most of my work was synchronous. I had a class where I had some guest speakers, and so the guest lectures were recorded, so students who weren't able to attend would be able to watch those offline. But I'm thinking that for the second point, working through problems on a chalkboard or whiteboard, you know, obviously that sounds like something that's really geared towards synchronous learning, right? But I could imagine that you could set up, obviously, some sample problems that you work out in a pre-recorded video that's available to students to watch online, but then also ask them to suggest problems that they would like to see worked out online, or give them the opportunity to record themselves working out these problems and then uploading them, and you can, you know, make certain ones available to the class. And maybe if somebody completely bombs something and you don't want to put them on the spot, you don't make that available. So.
Oh, so you're saying to upload even student problems? Is that what you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an option.
No, and what I love about that, Ira, too, is it's also very equitable, right? A lot of students in a whole group class might not want to ask you to solve a problem, but if you have a chat or a survey or a discussion forum where they can ask, you're really hearing from the students who are more hesitant. That's a brilliant idea. I think Barbara had her hand up. I don't know if she still does.
I know one thing that a lot of our students were saying in spring is that so many faculty move things to asynchronous, but then keep synchronous just as heavy loaded, that students over and over were complaining they just had double the work, you know? So, it is really concerning to, you know, if we have this mini lecture, then when we're live, are we accounting time for that, you know? So it's just really concerning. Mm-hmm.
Barbara, thank you for sharing. Yeah, I mean, a lot of our recommendations will be to like get down to 1 to 3 hours a week of synchronous at most, you know, even a 1 hour a week, and then have the rest be asynchronous for exactly that reason. You don't want to overload them with do all this stuff and still show synchronously. So thank you, Barbara. That's great. I'm also seeing that wait time works. So a lot of people are sharing in the Google Doc a lot of other ideas. I'm gonna let my co-facilitators kind of read through that and let me know if I should comment on any of that. But I'll also share this doc and share that we have an answer key down below with asynchronous options for anybody who's interested. So for everything that we had up there are asynchronous options is what we want to help you all realize. And
there's some really interesting ideas in the chat using, Karina talks about using an interactive video activity, which seems like a really neat idea. And then Jacob, or Jake, I don't know what you go by, that asking students to do peer-to-peer work by uploading, and then there's always that concern about distribution and who is cooperating, and that's always kind of a balance that you have to think about. And Linda, I'm very curious about your accidental group project that worked amazingly. Would you want to share with us what that was?
Yeah, I can't take any responsibility for it. We, in our work, we test people. We test people's cognition. And we had to move from in-person testing to telehealth. And the postdoc in the lab worked with the other students remotely, got all of the materials up in boxes and, you know, digitized. And then they worked with each other over the internet to to get good at the practice of testing over telehealth. And then we would come and meet as a group and troubleshoot, and you know, one of us would be their guinea pig, and we go back to the drawing board and fix the problems and come back. So it was a combination of synchronous and asynchronous, and it took about 3 weeks to pull it all together, but it was amazing what they did, and we then used that model to do it in a couple of other other circumstances. So it worked, but like I said, it was accidental. Now that I know what asynchronous is, now I understand how I can describe that.
Yeah, some of our best outcomes come from mistakes, right?
Yeah.
And it also sounds like it was a great experience for building community, right?
Right, and leadership, community and leadership. It was fantastic. So.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, Linda, for sharing that. And I think part of it is reflecting on how things are going and adapting if needed to go with what's working out, which is fantastic. I did want to respond to Jacob's question about that inequitable distribution. There are a lot of models that already existed before online instruction about peer assessment. And you know, no matter what, you'd want to have them informally assess one another, like how are we doing as a group, who's contributing more? But then you can always have them more formally assess one another so that there is some sort of accountability. And often just the sense of accountability will really help people feel responsible to one another in that sense, not that you can get away with it. Okay, we're gonna move on, and I'm just gonna give an example. Before you all think of your own asynchronous shifts, give you an example of mostly asynchronous delivery. So if you have a class where if you have an asynchronous option, where you're introducing basic concepts and sample questions. You can have readings, video, your publisher often has a lot of that stuff, and some questions on the topic. You can follow that up with some check for individual understanding. That could be a discussion forum post or a low stakes quiz or online homework, and that just helps students get used to the basic equations, vocab, or concepts. And once they've done that, that could be watching a recorded lecture, whatever it is, once they've checked their understanding, then they can work with their peers on the more challenging activities. And that, again, could be asynchronous on our discussion forum, but you know, we'd recommend you consider synchronous sessions where students are building community, and that's where they're applying the material to more challenging problems. We want to remind you, you need an alternative for the students who can't attend, but you can ask for and one alternative could be that people connect outside of class time, but indicate when they're going to connect, so that they're still connecting. And then that'll all lead up to content mastery. So that's one example you can adapt for your own course. This all gets at another student survey. We do appreciate the student voice as long as we're also doing it in evidence-based ways. And so when students were surveyed in May about the biggest decreases in the quality of the environment, this is a hard to read graph, but I'm going to highlight their feelings of loneliness got a lot worse. The amount of interaction with other students and classes got a lot worse, and the quality of that interaction got a lot worse. So this peer interaction piece was what really was standing out as worse for students. So looking for ways for them to engage can be helpful to them too. I hand it over to Sammy.
So next we want to talk about when and how do you want to use synchronous time to build community. Like Shauna said, the feelings of loneliness and things like that have probably been made worse by the pandemic. So how can we use synchronous time to build community? There's two main steps we're going to talk about. The first being incentivizing participation, such as points, but like Shauna mentioned, providing alternatives to these different participation points. So explaining why it will be useful for students to attend your lecture or your synchronous meeting, and then being at a specific time, might want to meet at another time with other students, and that can be facilitated like via doodle poll. And another one, it would be allowing them to drop the lowest 15% of their participation points. The second step would be during the discussion section. I don't know if anybody can hear me. It says my connection is unstable. Okay, you're good. Great. The next step is during the discussion section. That's another great time for us to build community. So having students come prepared, such as completing a quiz or assignment, and then doing group activity based on that section is useful to get everybody on the same page in terms of the basics and the vocabulary of the assignment. And then having icebreakers to build trust and communication is another way to facilitate those conversations and part of building community as well. If the discussion section is not an option, you can consider assigning groups based on interest or availability, and ask students to indicate when they'd be available to meet each week. So like that, they can set their own schedules and work asynchronously. So in breakout room number 3, we're going to give you guys 10 minutes to first plan out how you want to divide up what is asynchronous and asynchronous in the activities document. And then as a group, you're going to discuss at least one thing that you want to shift to asynchronous, and then discuss one way you want to make the most out of synchronous instruction.
Okay, thanks, Sammy. We're going to put you all into breakout rooms. Unless you have a last question. I see the chat is going crazy. Katie's responding, and I'll respond to anything that's left after we come back from our breakout rooms. Thanks, Sammy.
I know probably many of you were cut off mid-sentence like I was. And just a reminder that we are all still here for you. So any unanswered questions, you can always email us and opportunities to get questions answered and continue the conversation.
Yeah, the slides are shared. Do you want me to go ahead, Rachel? You got it.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay,
so we want to just wrap this up with giving you some next steps for what you can do next. And we're going to share the slides here, but I'm also going to share, at CEILS we have a one-page summary document that'll summarize some of this asynchronous versus synchronous with links to a lot of things. The admin site has a site on remote teaching that has links to different workshops. And there's a new CCLE site that's an online course for remote teaching for anybody who really wants to dive in. It's got different levels, but we have links to all those things. So
there are options on that online course for everybody. So if you just want to tweak one little thing about your course, or if you want more extensive kind of revision of your course, and then there's one aspect of it if you want to totally do an online course, which is something that would take a year to do. So there are different options for that online course. We do really appreciate your feedback, so please just take a few minutes and let us know how we did and what we can improve and what you liked and what you didn't like. There will be a UCLA Fall Teaching Forum that we will be participating in, and all of our workshops will be repeated along with some other goodies that we will provide. So just keep your eye out for that. On closing, the last thing I wanted to say is that, I just want to congratulate everybody for being here, because I think you're taking a proactive approach to your teaching in the fall, which is exactly what is needed, and emphasize the fact that whatever time and effort you're putting in on the front end is going to help you when we do go back to in-person, if and when that ever happens, which I assume it will, because all these activities that you're developing for student engagement are things that you will be able to use when you are in person. And maybe there are additional things that you hadn't even thought of because you were forced to in the remote environment. The last thing I would just want to say is that we talked about this in our group. The more human you can be with your students, the more the communication can be open and transparent, I think the more effective you're going to be. So really thinking about ways that you can humanize yourself for your students will help them be able to communicate with you better and let you know what they need. So thank you, everybody. Let us know if we can help you in any other way. Have a wonderful rest of your Friday and a fantastic weekend.